I was born in a middle upper class family, and my parents worked hard. Life was tough. My father used to say that art and artists were for the crazy people, not for the normal working class. And what was expected from me was to be as equal as all the other children. At the age of 6, when I was on my first year of school, there was a contest of who could draw the prettiest spaceship. I put my creativity to the test, and I killed all the competition. When I was 12, as gift for entering high school, I asked for an electric guitar to my father's dismay. He was completely against the idea and forced me to pay him back the guitar. However, I was able to convince my mother to secretly and behind my father's back enroll me on guitar lessons. When my mother met my father in the 1950s and fell in love with him, he forced her to quit her dream of becoming a painter. On another hand, the career of my father was booming. He became a very important person in an international company, which actually gave him more strength to the argument that artists did not bring money home. Therefore, it was mainly for the crazy bohemian people. So I grew up in a household where art was practically forbidden. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that my father was bad or evil. That was just how things were back then. Looking back in hindsight to those early years of my life, I can already see that I had the need and the urge to create. I distinctly remember my first contact with photography. My mother took me to a photographer in my hometown to be photographed when I was right about 4 years old. And I remember the photographer asking my mother, how do I keep him quiet? And my mother gave me the car keys and says, listen, play with the car keys and be in front of the camera. And this was the final result. My father, he used to travel a lot, and he would bring home these brand new toys, which I was very curious, and I would not rest until I would dismantle them, learn how they worked, and then put them back together in full working order. This action got me several times into trouble because all my parents could see was me apparently destroying the toy, when in fact it wasn't so. By the time I got to my later years of the teens, I was devouring music and literature. As a matter of fact, the first book I read in a foreign language was actually Bram Stoker's Dracula. I do remember that amidst book, my mind was racing so fast that I had to stop to calm myself. Then one day, while finishing up high school, in walks a disposable camera, and immediately I was hooked. Shortly after, somewhere between 1999 early 2000s, I bought an Olympus 830L 1.3 megapixel camera, and that's where things kicked in really hard. This because the camera was always with me. Everywhere I went, with whoever I went, the camera was always there to register the moment. This is a thing that even today still happens with me. I will faster leave my house without socks than without my camera. Now, truth be told, if I actually leave home without a camera, I feel completely vulnerable and completely naked. But eventually I left home, and a few years later I launched my first novel. My mother was completely ecstatic about it, and I gave her a copy of the book. My dad not so much. Telling him that there was an editor willing to publish my romance was like saying, "Hey Dad, can you pass me the salt, please?" By the time I launched my second book, they were both dead. Now, on what concerns photography, I started to read a lot, and I've purchased several books by Sebastião Salgado, by Klein, Artur Pastor, several photographers, and each image that they presented on the book, I did exactly the same on what I used to do with my own toys. I dismantled the photography piece by piece and then tried to stitch it back together, and like that I learned how they did it. And on what concerns genre, I have a tendency to go for street photography, and I also have an inherent tendency to go for abandoned places. Why? Because these places speak to me, and through them I can build a narrative and show it to you. On each image that I create, I decide what you see and what you don't see. I decide the importance of this object over another object. I tell you where you're going to look first and what you're not going to look and completely disregard. I very rarely shoot color, and there is a reason behind it, because I find that color is too distracting and it forces the viewer to look somewhere else where I don't want the viewer to look. Black and white suits me like a glove. My need to create is in such order that I can only describe it as Dantesque. To give you a very clear idea, in 2020, while during the first wave and second wave of the pandemic, I was diagnosed with a health problem and I was sent to hospital for 3 weeks. When I got there, the doctor told me that he was not so sure if I would leave it by my own feet or inside a black plastic bag. However, my need to create didn't stop. And on the second day, I arranged that my Nikon F with a 50mm lens and 4 rolls of foam apart to be smuggled in via the dirty laundry. Do bear in mind that we were on lockdown, so I had no visitors whatsoever, and on the following day I was photographing at the hospital. I was not sure if I would get out of there alive, but I was happy photographing everything. But going back on my history, I have to say that although my father was never very supportive on what concerns art, he always wanted what he considered to be the best for us. Unfortunately for me, this did not pass through art, but I always had good clothing, good food on my table, so I really cannot complain. He gave his best, and let's leave it like that. On what concerns my mother though, somewhere in the decade of the 2000s, she had a big argument with my father and she gave a rebel yell. She was very angry at him, not because of only art but several other aspects as well, so she decided to go back painting and she enrolled herself in classes. And she did a really awesome work. Unfortunately for her, the rebel yell was given too late in her life. She was already retired, she was in the late 60s, and then she contracted the German's disease, Alzheimer. She died shortly after. Irony on all this was that my mother deeply loved my father, and she was actually very afraid of dying, always saying to us, to me and my sister, that in case she would go first, she would come rapidly to come and pick up my dad. My dad died 6 months after her. One of the hobbies that he had was actually fishing. He enjoyed fishing and he taught me how to fish as well. So when he died, he was cremated and I scattered his ashes on his favorite place where he liked to go fishing. My mom lays along with my grandmother and grandfather in the family's tomb in a very small city just up north Lisbon. So, what about now? What about the present and the future? And I have to admit that I actually don't know. There's just one thing that I'm very sure of. I'll still be photographing, although I have a huge collection of images, which you probably on this video saw about 1% of them. There is one thing I am very certain of. I will still have my Nikons, I will still have my Canons, my Rolleiflexes, my Mamiyas, my Hasselblads. I will have them all and I will still shoot until I'm very old, until the very last breath of me.